Hi, everybody. So when we were developing these panels, they were all originally called something versus something because we thought it was quite kind of punchy and get the polarity in. We eventually changed them all to and. So it was safety and danger, and it was clinics and churches. But this one, in particular, we kept versus because I think in the last, certainly the last 3 or 4 years in particular, we've been seeing something I think that many people thought we wouldn't see, which is psychedelics becoming commodities in a market. And there are pros to that, there are cons to that, but certainly what we've been seeing is a lot of tension around it, and I think it really taps into a lot of the deeper questions we ask ourselves as a society about what we value, what is sacred, what is more important than money. And so these are some of the questions we're going to explore from a lot of different perspectives in this panel. And I'm sure you all have, a lot of ideas about this and your own feelings around it. It's something that doesn't just apply to psychedelics, it applies to a lot of different things in culture. What is that tension point? What is the healthy and right relationship between something that is healing, something that many people regard as sacred, something that has a deep tradition in indigenous cultures? What is the right relationship to that? How do we ensure that as psychedelics go mainstream, they go mainstream in a way that is something that when 20 years down the line, we can look back and say, yeah, that actually led to a better, fairer world for all of us, rather than back to the same situation we're in now, where we have a mental health crisis and a number of other crises that we're facing, including the environmental crisis. So I'm really looking forward to this. I have an amazing panel of speakers here. And going to begin, our format, just to remind you, everyone will have a few minutes to introduce themselves and their perspective on the topic. Then we'll have a group discussion, and then we're going to open it out to a discussion with all of us. So, Ozan Polat, I would love you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your perspective on this topic.
Thank you for having me here, Ali. It's actually, so my name is Ozan Polat. I work with Vine Ventures, where I'm a general partner. Vine is a $25 million venture capital fund focusing on early stage investments in what we call conscious health and wellness, with a bit of a differentiated approach. It was a few years ago when my partner at Vine, Ryan Zur, visited Breaking Convention, that after this visit, he founded Vine Ventures. So it's kind of coming full circle now, being here. Thank you very much for having me. As we entered this space, when you came here and you said you were a venture capitalist, usually people would have their shields go up, their defensive shields, and be like, take out their crosses as if they've seen Lord Dracula himself. And for us, this was to some degree also understandable because we are psychonauts ourselves, and when we entered the space, we knew we need to rethink how venture capital is being done for a more sustainable psychedelic space to emerge. Because as this space emerges, the role of venture capital also increases because these teams that are out there working on solutions and treatments, they need to be capitalized so that they can go out and reach millions of lives. But we want to be less extractive capital and more constructive capital, to say it in David Bronner's words, which means for us rethinking how value is being accrued and how value is being distributed. Because those traditional systems, as we've seen it now, they brought us so far, but we see the discrepancy now, how this value is being accrued and distributed, and by whom is it accrued. So we went into this space with the thought that we need to have a way to have a more sustainable and more equitable growth for the space to emerge. And we believe that the psychedelic space is actually one of the best suited to rethink those traditional structures of capitalism and come up with structures that improve millions of lives globally. So at Vine, we've built in since day one a reciprocity pledge, which means 50% of our GP profit, we pool that we invite the entrepreneurs of our portfolio companies to decide how this capital is being redistributed back to nonprofits, to academia and research, to indigenous communities. And this is for two reasons. The first is to create the awareness with our entrepreneurs that the space is built up on years long of fights of nonprofits, of academia and research, or thousands of years of practice of indigenous communities. And on the other hand, also we want our entrepreneurs to know that the value that they create, they can decide at the end how a big chunk of that value gets redistributed into this space to have a more sustainable approach. Also, how we did this, how we walked the talk is we were approached by MAPS who said, look guys, we raised 120 million in 30 years in donations. With FDA approval on the horizon, we need to raise the same amount now in 2 years. And we sat down, and our major goal there was, the baseline caveat was, we need to find a way how MAPS can raise this money in this high pace, but remain non-profit, so patient accessibility is their number one goal, and not creating value for shareholders, right? And once you go for profit, the genie is out of the bottle, right? The culture changes slowly in the organization. So we sat down, we developed a novel financial instrument together with MAPS that allows them to raise 70 million in a very short time period, that allows them to raise this at the same time, remain non-profit, and have their IP far away from any investor. So that the culture of MAPS is not going to change, and patient accessibility is going to remain their number one goal. And my TradFis, my traditional finance friends, they ask me, like, why do you raise 70 million for a non-profit? And it's quite easy. I ask myself, how do I want this space to emerge? And I want organizations like MAPS to be the first mover, to set the commercial and the cultural benchmark for a more open and collaborative, more equitable growth in the psychedelic space. And that's why we've developed this novel financial instrument, because at Vine we deeply believe that the psychedelic space should not be controlled by a handful of pharma companies and kept in check by them. We believe that we will have a more open and sustainable space, and we fight every day for this space to emerge in this way. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Angela Prusa, and I am a cannabinoid practitioner. I've been working with cannabis for over a decade. And I've also been advocating for the legalization of cannabis in my home of Namibia. I also work as a NADA acupuncture practitioner for trauma and addiction. So for me, it is all about honoring the communities who have been, for example, in terms of prohibition, have suffered the most under prohibition. So the legalization model and legislation that I advocate for in Namibia is all about honoring those communities, investing into those communities, making sure that they have a seat at the table. I think this is really important because it's a really fast-paced evolving market just in terms of the cannabis market. And a lot of these communities are being left behind. They're not getting a seat at the table. They're not around when the discussions and the legislations are drawn up. There's no proper representation of their communities and cultures. So for me, that's one of the aspects. The other one is being in reciprocity with nature and the plant and working with it in a sacred way, honoring the spirit of the plant, honoring the nature, in the way that we plant cannabis, for example. I work specifically with cannabis, so I'm going to focus on cannabis. There's a lot of big industry growths happening that are not beneficial to the environment, and I think it's really important that we look at how we can work sustainably with this plant so that it is beneficial to nature, it's beneficial to the communities, and at the core of it as well, that it has the knowledge of these communities, of the local communities of the Global South, or for example, the Rastafari communities, that knowledge is also being seen as evidence. Because way before Western science made the discoveries of the endocannabinoid system, for example, the Rasta communities have been working with cannabis as a medicine and as a spiritual and sacred sacrament for many, 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 many decades. And it's really important that we invest, to make our money mean something good, is to invest into those communities, to make sure that moving forward, that those people who are still being criminalized and sitting in prison, while some people are making millions from this plant, that we take them along with us and that we invest into programs that essentially help, these communities, help these people, help with the processes to get them out of prison. I think we have to change the paradigm a little bit. There's the dominant Western paradigm of, only Western science is accepted as evidence. And only the Western paradigm of capitalism is the way in which this system is being built up. And I think that we need to make space for these other ways of being, these ways of being that come from the heart, that come from deep connection with these plants. And for me as well, I work with cannabis, and the way I work with it is I honor the spirit of the plant. So anytime I touch the medicine, I bring offerings first and foremost, and I make sure that I never touch the plant when I'm feeling angry or jealous or enraged, because I understand that the energy that I put into that medicine is going to be what the patient is going to take into their body. I have a brand that I've built up with my beautiful sister and business partner Talene called Roots Herbal, and we make sure that we invest into the communities who grow the cannabis for us. So we work with communities in Africa, and for example, we're in the process of buying land for them, which will benefit the community. We pay the prices that they tell us. We don't haggle. We invest into projects, that benefit the community. We make sure that we use our profits, again, to put into communities, for example, helping homeless people off of the streets, and off of drug addictions, or supporting them in a holistic way to come off the drugs. So I think it's really important to see that there is ways to work in this industry in a really heart-centered way, one that has reciprocity, social and health equity at the core of it, and one that also has the voices of those communities. They're lacking. We need to make space and need to invest that there is a safe space for those communities to speak up as well. Because, for example, I'm going to use a quick example because I can see I've got 1 minute left. Where the majority of us with fair skin are able to sit here and discuss psychedelics and discuss how we work with them, our psychedelic businesses, people of color don't have that same privilege. So we need to invest into creating those safe spaces. The perfect example is Glastonbury versus Notting Hill Carnival. And so those of us who are in this space, and especially those of us profiting from these plants and from the massive healing that we're receiving, it's our rent, to put back that money into sustainability projects, into those communities, and making sure that it benefits the earth and the communities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Amanda Feilding, and I, long before most of you were born probably, decided to dedicate my life to the understanding of psychedelics and how best to use them as tools to improve life, health, happiness of myself and humanity generally. So in 1966, I dedicated myself to a lifetime's mission to how do we explore the scientific basis of how they work and how do we integrate them into society. And so the first, whatever it is 30 years, I had 2 working companions, and I experimented on myself, and I realized many breakthrough things about them and how they work, and how you can have a serious working life using, in my case, LSD as a tool to expand consciousness. And so at that point, our talk, I know, is about financing. At that point, financing wasn't the problem, because I knew the only way to break through the taboo when it came upon us with the ridiculous UN conventions, tying up the whole world on misplaced truths. And we had to overcome that, and I realized the only way to do that was with the very best science, because science is the god of the modern society, and so through science one had to prove why these compounds are so invaluable to humanity. And so for the first 30 years or so, I did what I can to find doctors, scientists, politicians, and to be interested in that approach. But I realized after 30 years it was very much an uphill struggle, and that a single woman with no letters after my name and no money to speak of couldn't single-handedly do that. So I became a foundation. As my husband says, he married a woman and found himself in bed with a foundation. So with the foundation, I had the best scientists in the world on my advisory board, and that opened the doors to many things. And so then I started doing research and holding seminars at the House of Lords about drug policy, basically about psychedelics, cannabis, and why the regulations around them should be totally changed. And so as a foundation, I became dependent on, I had no money, I was dependent on philanthropic gifts. So I ran the foundation almost with no money, and some very kind individuals gave me enough to do what I did in a very minimal fashion. And I have to say, I started the study for overcoming nicotine addiction at Johns Hopkins. I had $5,000, and I wrote to Roland saying I had $5,000, and he said, "What would you like to do?" And I said, "Why not overcome nicotine addiction?" Because I did that in 1966, and I know it works. And so we started that study. And then later, with Dave Nutt, who was one of the people on my advisory board, I persuaded him to join me in collaboration in studying psychedelics. So we started at Bristol, and then we went to Imperial and started the Berkeley Imperial Research Program, and so on. And that was started actually with £30,000, is what I committed myself to find as a yearly thing to start it. And we did many of the breakthrough studies on that. But why I'm saying this is how one was fighting to get psychedelics recognized for their immense possible value to humanity. And it was an upward struggle for the next, whatever it is, 40 years or so. And now suddenly it's become like with the wind from the cannabis business, big capital sees positive future. So it's an interesting thing. We need big capital, but at the same time, it's interesting how it actually makes life of finding philanthropic money for not-for-profit exploratory research more difficult, because the sweet funders say, well, there are two wells, one which is a bottomless well, and the other produces potential of great money. And so that's the situation we're at now, and it's very interesting. We desperately need capital, for-profit capital. So it's great where we've got to, and I'm very excited about moving it forward.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Ben Sessa. I'm a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist. I've been working in psychedelic research for getting on 20 years now. I'm a trained and approved MDMA, psilocybin and ketamine psychotherapist, senior research fellow at Imperial College London, and chief medical officer for Awaken Life Sciences, which is a new startup that we've put together in the last few years. We are in the midst of a major mental health crisis globally. Approximately a third of all adults will experience a clinical, medical, psychiatric problem in their lifetime. And we are looking at suboptimal current traditional treatments for major public health problems, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and particularly addictions. These are big problems. These are not rare disorders. These have very high prevalence rates, and our treatments are lousy. We've had modern contemporary psychiatry for over 100 years, and we have clinical outcomes for these major disorders which are embarrassing in the field of medicine. PTSD, 60% treatment resistance. Addictions, 80 to 90% treatment resistance after 100 years of modern psychiatry. Why are we in this position? Because we, for the last 40 to 50 years in psychiatry, have painted ourselves into a corner of top-down biological psychiatry in which we give daily maintenance drugs to paper over the cracks and treat the symptoms of these disorders without getting to the heart of them, which is trauma. I'm one of those doctors that does not really believe in categorical diagnoses very much. Whether you have an eating disorder, a personality disorder, anxiety, PTSD, depression, or an addiction of any particular type, almost all of these are underpinned by severe childhood trauma, almost all of them. And so the actual diagnosis you end up getting is a bit like the sprouting body of an underlying mycelium mushroom bed, where the underlying mycelium is trauma, and one little mushroom will pop up, and it could be an eating disorder, it could be personality disorder, it could be an addiction, it doesn't really matter. So we have this symptom-focused treatment. Now, we have in our hands the most innovative and creative technologies of the last 100 years, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies. This can radically shift this battle that we are losing around this massive epidemic mental health disorder crisis. It is very expensive to carry out public health care. It cannot be done through donation alone. Rick Doblin has done a wonderful job of gobbling up all the philanthropists and donors left on the planet, which is fantastic, and MAPS as a non-profit organization is remarkable and unique. But we need to be realistic. To go forward, we need an awful lot of money. And I know that big pharma are the villains that we all think. There's many aspects of big pharma that I am immensely jealous of. Mainly, they're hundreds of millions of dollars. That money could be used fantastically to provide good public health care through psychedelic programs. We need to find ways to step up and get this cash into psychedelics. And this needs to be done through careful scientific study, like Amanda says, and also venture capitalists. And we need these billionaires, and we need them now.
So, hi everybody, I'm Timmy Davis. I work in policy for the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, but I'm also training and practicing as a psychotherapist. And that's the perspective that I'm going to be taking today, thinking about money versus meaning. This week was the Psychedelics and Philosophy Conference in Exeter. And I was reminded by Osiris Gonzalez, I wasn't there unfortunately, but he mentioned why psychedelic therapy was beginning to be researched in the first place in the 1950s. You know, again, as Ben said, you know, there are some conditions that are almost intractable. And at the time they were looking at alcoholism. Essentially, they wanted a way to be able to save time and money. They wanted new treatments. But I think that now this search for savings in time and money has hypertrophied. and I want to ask sort of at what cost. Meta-analyses show that the most salient factor in successful psychotherapy is meaningful relationship. And meaningful relationships take time to build. We're much too focused on the drugs at the moment, I think. It bears repeating that psychedelics are adjuncts to psychotherapy. We say psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, but really we should be saying therapy assisted by psychedelics. I think that this is partly due to the profit motive. I understand that drug trials cost a whole lot of money. Thanks. Yeah, I do understand that drug trials cost a whole lot of money and are the route to ending prohibition, to gaining wider access. But I think that there's more to think about here. These companies, it seems, are now trying to save time and not save money, but make money. This is a distinct difference. They're all trying to individuate from one another, you see? Like, they're all sort of still stuck in this fetishization of pharmacology, as if we're going to, stick with this drug specificity model where one drug will be better for one disorder, and that's the route that we'll go. Why else do we see all this research into all these different drugs, looking for novel compounds all of the time? We're trying to save money, look for drug specificity. So I think that, this is quite a problem and kind of misses the point. And oftentimes, we're seeing, it's already been mentioned today, a kind of race to the bottom. Even trying to reduce therapist contact time to zero, drugs without the therapy. And while the experiences elicited by these drugs can be meaningful, I think that, a meaningful experience does not a meaningful life make. I think it's really important to bear that in mind. And a meaningful life requires work over time, much like these therapeutic relationships. And so I would kind of like to place a bet, actually. I would bet that one DMT dose in a year of psychotherapy relationship is going to be more efficacious than 4 LSD doses over 2 months. That's just my view. I hope we can see it play out in the literature. Hopefully one day we'll see that kind of study done. And for context, £7,000 will get you 4 ketamine infusions over 4 months, or twice weekly therapy for over a year. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. I think we should be asking, how can these drugs be used in a meaningful way in a relational psychotherapeutic context? How can they be introduced into an ongoing relationship and maximize the benefit of that ongoing relationship? It's very easy to sort of create insight and change with these drugs. But then how do you make it enduring? How do you make it continue? How do you make sure this person integrates it into their life? A couple of Zoom sessions with a therapist isn't going to do it. We're talking about psychic transformation and life transformation. So I just want to sort of, return to this thing. What is it that we're trying to create? What is the motive of these various companies that are investing in these novel compounds, all that kind of thing? I think that, some are trying to create return customers rather than meaningful lives. I think that there's 2 ethical positions here. There's one where a company can be a provider of drugs, creating return customers, dependence upon the therapist, dependence upon the institution, dependence upon the drug. And another where they can be providers of therapy, creating a drug that will be able to be used in the context of an ongoing psychotherapeutic relationship to maximize the transformation and insight that the person can have.
So thank you, everyone. Lots and lots to chew on there. And I want to zoom out a little bit and touch on something that Angela mentioned, which was the idea of the paradigm we're working in. So like the kind of bigger picture within which all of this is happening, within which we're raising money, etc. And maybe just introducing the question I'd like to ask the panel with a kind of thought experiment of, imagine that someone very close to you, perhaps a partner or a sibling, needs a ride from the airport. And they get in touch and say, hey, could you give me a ride from the airport at 3 o'clock next Tuesday? And you said, sure, how far is it? I think it's 25 kilometers. Okay, it's going to be roughly 30 quid. Is that all right? How do you feel if you were to charge them? Would you charge them, right? Would it feel different to ask them for money? And probably, from the disgusted shakes of heads I'm seeing in the audience, it would feel odd, right? And that's because money, I would argue it's because money changes the game we're playing together, and it changes the dynamics. So what I'm really curious about, and what's often wrestled with in this question is, can we actually introduce psychedelic therapy, psychedelics into a system where the rules of the game are very clear. There's one rule, which is profit at all costs. I know there are different approaches to that, though, right? There are different games we can play. And so, Ozan, for example, you're mentioning a different way of approaching this within the current game we're playing. But I'm really curious to hear from everyone here whether you think that we can have a kind of healthy, fair, and by fair I mean access to people who aren't just extremely rich, with a kind of reciprocity that Angela was talking about as well. Can we do it in our current game of market capitalism that we're playing right now as a society, or do we need to change the game entirely? So, big question. And anyone who feels drawn to answer first, please go ahead.
I think yes, we can do it in our current game. But we've just got to move away from this idea of a therapy package. You know, psychotherapy is a really interesting industry. You've got loads and loads of therapists, and they're all self-employed, and they all do it in their own way. You know, they carry on. It's like they're just individuals making the money for themselves. They're not stacking up huge profits or this kind of thing. You know, they're just doing the work. Some do better than others, etc. You know, like the competition's still there, all that kind of thing. But companies that are developing drugs are doing an entirely different thing. They're trying to put these drugs into a therapy package that then can be sold as something else entirely. I don't think that's necessary.
I do think it is possible, but I do think that there has to be some change of heart around the current way that we operate. For example, in the cannabis space, I feel that any company that currently creates cannabis products and markets and sells those is required to give some of their profits towards either prisoners still sitting in prison for cannabis offenses, or investing into communities that are disproportionately past and present harmed by the prohibition model. And I think it's also really important that any conversation, especially at the level of legislation, has to involve those communities. We cannot have conversations about medical cannabis without having people from the Rastafari community there and people of color, because there is no representation. So, and I think that we need to come more into the heart and away from the capitalist paradigm that we're putting on these plants. These plants are really intelligent beings with their own spirit, and we need to start treating them like that. We need to have respect for them, and we need to be in reciprocity with them and the ecosystem that they come from. And the other thing is as well, what I've seen in the way that I work, when I work with the plants like this in full reciprocity and integrity and honoring them, there is a great financial reward. Money always flows, and the more we can make our money mean good, the more it can flow to everybody.
I don't believe that the game is profit maximization. I believe that this was the game, but we're slowly waking up and realizing that, you know, this game that has been sold to us as this is the number one rule, can be rethought, right? As I said in the beginning, you know, value is being accrued, value is being created, by whom and how, and then how is value being distributed, right? And I didn't enter this space to maximize my profits or to maximize LP's profits. I entered this space because I'm a psychonaut myself, and whenever I have a psychedelic experience, I get out of this, and I deeply wish that everybody in the world can experience this. And I always jokingly say that when we're at a point where where it's so normalized that my mom is actually, you know what, I'm gonna do, you know, try out the psychedelics you've been talking about, my son, that's the point when I can retire. Then I'm good, right? Like, we've achieved our goal, right? We're helping millions of people, and it's so normalized that even my mother, she would never touch a cigarette, right? And, you know, this is the first time I've been an investor myself for many years. I've been very active in the Web3 space, and, you know, once you go down that rabbit hole, it takes a lot to come out. And for the first time, the psychedelic space, with this space, there was a space that could deter my focus from Web3. Because as I said, my wish deep down is that I want this to be accessible to everybody. And the mental health crisis that we quoted before, that is coming up on us, is we need to find new solutions for this. And I believe 100% you can find these new solutions without packaging it into how do we get recurring patients, right? It's possible. As said, you know, some of the best work is done by non-profits. Look at MAPS, look at Usona Institute, that provide solutions without patenting it, and at the same time healing people, right? We saw 60% of patients are treatment resistant. With the MAPS protocol, we see 67% of patients being healed from PTSD. And this in a way that they can do it as a non-profit and at the same time without patenting it. And I believe it's possible to have 1,000 flowers bloom instead of the long shadow cast by a patent. And the psychedelic space is the best space to innovate, is one of the best spaces to innovate on these traditional capitalistic structures.
Thank you. Awesome.
I think that the philanthropic approach to funding is amazingly important, because then it's not in any way profit driven. So all the early research was financed that way. And I think we want to make an effort that we don't lose that. But at the same time, one needs many, many hundreds of millions to come in. We need these compounds to be regulated very soon, because the evidence has shown that they are more efficacious than the other treatments they're replacing. And so we want to make therapy access to these compounds much, much easier. And therefore, we don't want the old standards of capitalism, where the duty of the people running the company is to maximize the profit. We rather want a new form of capitalism, ethical capitalism, I like to call it, where the purpose is to do good for humanity, for the group, but also obviously make money back on the money you put in. But it's not that 10 times markup in 2.5 years, which is not productive. And I think we need to hold in reverence that these compounds have always been used for sacramental, spiritual, social benefit. And indeed, original founders of the psychedelic world, and Albert Hofmann and Sasha, were truly worked along those principles. And I have to say, when I started, I never ever thought of profit or making money out of it or anything. It was just, how do you do the research which will move the game onwards? And we've moved it onwards, and now it's at a different phase. But I think this phase needs the concept, which you're recognizing, of ethical capitalism, together with philanthropy. Philanthropy still leaves one freer to just do the research with his best. I mean, I'm doing a program of research at the moment which has no profit in it, but has great value for us to understand more about consciousness, the mystical experience, how we can use these conditions. And what is very fascinating is that science killed off spirituality, and now at the very center of the new science, i.e. healing psychological disorders, which is a pandemic, is that the mystical experience is correlated with the most success in the healing. So it's a rather sweet kind of circle. And I think we need to work out how we fund the research without stifling the exploratory research, and then make access available for everyone in the world. It's essential that these compounds don't become like painkillers, where 20% of the world used 80% of the painkillers. We don't want that. We want psychedelics to be equally available to rich and poor countries, rich and poor people, and that we must maintain as our aim.
Thank you.
Yeah, I absolutely refute the suggestion that this is about profit for those of us who are clinicians in the field. It's offensive, actually, to be told that. I have worked fastidiously for my patients' benefit my entire life. My goal, my aim, is to see maximum use of psychedelics for as many people as possible. We have 3 clinics in Bristol, London and Oslo. We're opening another one in Oslo, one in Stockholm, one in Manchester, one in Edinburgh and one in Dublin. And we plan to have 15 to 20 high street bricks and mortar clinics throughout the UK and Europe in the next 4 years. Now, this is a very expensive piece of work to build these and make these work. And you have to do this through successful revenue and income, or it won't happen. We can't just want it to magically happen. It has to be a viable business. And that does not mean that it cannot be done ethically, but we cannot be unrealistic and just pretend this will magically happen. In order for this business to remain viable and for us to do the good work we do, we have to make money in order to continue to get investment so we can carry on getting patients through the door. Now, at the moment, it is private. And people often ask me, why isn't this on the NHS? And my answer is, that's a question you need to ask the NHS. There's nothing I want more than the awakened treatments to be on the NHS. It would be fantastic if it was on the NHS. And we work with the NHS, we work with local commissioners, we're carrying out pilot schemes. It makes absolute financial sense for psychedelic therapies to be on the NHS. Psychedelic therapies have an enormous economic benefit to society. As an addiction psychiatrist, I've lost count of the times I've put patients through expensive 3 to 6 month inpatient rehabs at the cost of £50,000 and seen them on the 6th month walk out straight into the pub. It happens all the time. It costs millions over the lifetime of a patient to have these suboptimal treatments. So it makes economic sense, and the NHS will buy psychedelic therapies and will save an awful lot of money and do the right thing. At the moment, it's private, and as a socialist and an NHS worker myself, I'm not entirely comfortable with that, but that's where we are. It costs £6,000 for the ketamine treatment in Bristol. Now, I don't care who pays that £6,000. I don't care if it's MHRA or NICE or AXA or Bupa or Wellcome or the CCG or the GP or a rich patient with £6,000 in their pockets. But it costs £6,000. And the sooner we can get this into public healthcare and paid for by the National Health Service, the better. In the meantime, we have to have a viable business or we can't do the good things we're doing. Now, ethical capitalism is a good thing, and I support everything that everyone said on the panel about feeding this money back into the good causes, remembering and respecting the origins of these medicines, and maintaining the sacred and ceremonial use of the medicines, local community developments, bringing in local facilitators, and spreading the wealth. But we cannot get away from the fact that if we're going to do this and we're going to build bricks and mortar clinics and treat people on the high street, we need to have a viable business, and that requires money and it requires profits.
Thank you, everyone. We'll do one more round, and then we're going to open it up for questions. I would love to hear, because I think everyone will have a perspective on this. I want to keep going on this topic of access. Who gets to actually access psychedelics? Timmy mentioned that for £6,000-7,000, you probably have a year of psychotherapy. But psychotherapy is also quite a middle-class pursuit, largely, right? So there's an access problem even with psychotherapy. Angela, you were speaking about the various groups you're working with across the world who have used, for example, cannabis religiously, and then are kind of cut out of the big money that comes up. And of course, we're seeing that in psychedelics as well. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how do you think. So Ben, you laid out one potential, which is private first and then into the NHS. Now, of course, there's an NHS here, but in America, it's a very, very different story, and that's where a lot of the money is. And every country is different. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts around how do you see us moving towards a place where, as Amanda said, it's not just for the rich or the poor, for the very rich, but it's or for one particular group of countries, but we have a kind of very healthy ecosystem of psychedelic access around the world. So anyone want to pick up on that?
You go first.
Right, thank you.
I'll go after you.
That's a very good question, patient accessibility. I grew up in the 90s in Switzerland. There was a time when the Balkan Wars were happening. We had so many refugees coming, and I went to class with them, I went to school with them, and some of them were just outbursts and it would like pure anger, and the teachers were like, I don't know why this kid is like this, but these people are coming from a war zone, and we see intergenerational trauma, right? And we're not even talking about the US, which is supposedly a developed country, right? We're talking about the Balkans here, that everybody's looking down to, right? And these people, they are so far away from access to the treatments we're talking about here. And this is what gets me going. This is how I want to see, when we talk about patient accessibility, right? Or the topics that Angela picked up before when we talk about access. And in this sense, right, if you configure it in the US, for example, we see, again, to quote MAPS, for example, I know the data there best, we see MAPS is going into this with the lowest price point possible so that insurances will fully cover it. And they come in with a program for patients who are underinsured, right? And then I see other strategies from, let's just call them pharma bros, getting into this space who've never had psychedelic experiences themselves. And I know this from personal connections with them, that are aiming for price points around 15 to 25K per treatment that only the 1% or the 2%, if they're generous, can afford. So for me, how we see this play out is we need to, and now when I say we, I mean us as capital deployers, we need to make sure that those mission-driven entrepreneurs are very well capitalized and put in the best position possible to set these commercial and these cultural benchmarks, right? So that insurances look at it, for example, and say, I don't know, like MDMA and psilocybin, for an insurance, these are two economic substitutes. I think I speak for everybody here, these are two completely different compounds. But an insurer will look at it and say, one costs just a quarter or just less than a quarter of what the other costs. Sorry, we will only cover the amount that this treatment costs, right? In this case, in MAPS. So for me, it's about making sure that you can set these people, these teams, these entrepreneurs in the best position possible, and then allow them to accrue value in this way. That patient accessibility is the #1 goal, but then take this value that has been accrued, distribute it to people who are underinsured, distribute it to countries, I mean, I'm not going to even talk about Syria and what's happening in Northern Africa and all these people who are displaced, going through trauma, but make sure that these people can accrue value, can make a profit, and then take this profit and go into these other countries and these other regions and make sure that they have access. Because these are the people we usually think about least, but these are the people that usually need it most, right?
So my point of view on this is, for example, and I can just now speak from my personal way of doing it. For example, in the cannabis space and currently in the UK, the only prescribers of cannabis are either the NHS or private clinics. And there's a whole network of us who are not doctors, but who work in the health industry, who help people with cannabis. And we do this at a really affordable way. We have taken years to study this plant. We do it in a really safe way. We understand the plant. We work with people in support. And this is another way, for example, that I see that we can access more people, because currently we are not being recognized at all. It's only doctors who are trained, and I have so many patients that come to me who have been to cannabis doctors or been to private cannabis clinicians who've paid hundreds of pounds for a treatment that was essentially ineffective. And then they come to us and we, treat them, we provide them with support, and the medicine that we provide them with, comes from a really good source, comes with reciprocity, we know how it's grown, we support the community where it's grown, and then it costs them very little money so that it's a sustainable model. So that's why I'm also saying we have to move away from this Western paradigm of science and knowledge and medicine. There is other paradigms. I grew up in Africa, so I'm really privileged to have seen other ways of how people work with medicine and with knowledge. And so I'm utilizing that as inspiration. And in return, the profits that I make from helping people with this plant, I then take to bring, for example, cannabis to communities in Africa that can't afford it and don't have access to it, showing them how to make it, but also providing them with free cannabis oil. And I think this model is really sustainable. It can't just be people who are doctors, for example, to be prescribing cannabis. There's a whole network of really amazing cannabinoid practitioners who are fully capable to support patients.
One thing I think is very important as we move forward is that the new psychedelic industry doesn't follow too much the old patterns. Obviously, people who invest hundreds of millions of pounds to get a compound regulated have to have a system which enables them to make the money back with the profit. But at the same time, I think it's essential that these compounds, which are God's gift, if you like, or was always considered the food of the gods, isn't owned exclusively by one person and one group, and that these compounds are available to be produced and used at a much lower rate as well. And that can quite easily be done by just keeping it open, the market for different private enterprises to create the different compounds and keep them competitive. And I do think that the for-profit sphere is essential to produce these hundreds of millions of pounds, which are going to be used to get the compounds regulated. I mean, of course, the changing of the policy, which is insane, because it's still based on the old factors that these compounds are extremely dangerous and have no medical use. Well, that is totally wrong, and we know it's wrong, but not one word of the UN Convention has yet been changed. And if these compounds were rationalizedly regulated, it would be much, much easier to get sustainable access to them for many more millions of people. And that's actually, I think, very seriously what we have to fight for. And obviously, a lot of us have been fighting for it for 50 years, and it's moved, but it hasn't, one word of the UN conventions hasn't been changed yet. And so I think it's protecting free trade and not tying things up too much. I mean, in the past, there are certain compounds which have been put under IP, which means that the suffering patients haven't had access to them for 15 years or something. And that ideally shouldn't be allowed to happen. But at the same time, we need the people who invest the hundreds of millions to be able to make money back on it, but in a controlled way.
Okay, so, I mean, people often equate this word medicalization with corporatization. I see the word medicalization as increased accessibility. And it's interesting hearing about the underground uses of these medicines, and absolutely, that is not going anywhere. That will always be there. But for the vast majority of everyday patients in the UK and elsewhere, they want this to be provided by a legal provider under a supervised, scrutinized, regulated body. And they will not use underground therapy. So I absolutely support underground therapy, and there's an enormous wealth of expertise and experience in the underground movements, and always has been. But it's not going to be enough to treat this massive global health problem that we have. These need to be regulated into legal, systematic frameworks, because that's how the system works, and that's what patients want. When thinking about the cost of psychedelic therapies, we also need to look at what is the cost of not doing them. Now, there's nothing more expensive than an untreated psychiatric patient. They cost millions over a lifetime. Often people with chronic mental disorders don't work and on disabilities. They are overrepresented in the courts and the prison systems. They are overrepresented with physical health problems. They are overrepresented in the family law and courts and social services. It's very, very expensive to not adequately treat mental health disorders. So when you look at the price of a psychedelic therapy, it's a drop in the ocean. And if we can do in an 8-week outpatient treatment from our Awaken clinics what would normally take 6 months and cost 10 times as much, the economic benefits are great. Just wanted to say a brief thing about new molecule design as well. Now, I have absolutely no problem with creative psychopharmacology that's coming up with new molecules. That's just good science. And what's interesting is some of the voices within the psychedelic community that object to this and say, get your hands off our sacred LSD, don't mess with it. You know, they hold Sasha Shulgin up as this wonderful person, quite rightly, wonderful man, wonderful chemist. What do you think Sasha did his entire life if it wasn't tweak every single psychedelic compound? He loved methylating this, ethylating that, adding this phosphate group, taking that one off, and he also loved creating psychedelics with no psychoactivity, because he was a fantastic scientist and a wonderful chemist. So let's not be scared of creative psychopharmacology. If it turns out we can come up with an LSD analog that has no psychoactivity but wonderfully treats knee pain, what's wrong with that? So now I would be concerned about new molecule design if it meant somehow we were going to lose LSD. And by making analogues of LSD or MDMA or psilocybin, then the old ones disappear. That's rubbish. There will always be mushrooms in Wales. There will always be festivals. There will always be raves. There will always be underground care. And these are great things. No one's taking those away. Psychedelic culture has thrived and grown and blossomed under medicalization.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. There's always going to be people that want access, and this is an interesting thing that the word hasn't been said yet. But decriminalization, people are going to want access. They're also, and I totally agree, are going to want access through a trained provider, a professional, and that's why I see the field essentially bifurcating already into the medicalization and all the good things we've all already said, we all know, like the money has to happen, it's what's driving it forward and the policy work and all this kind of thing, that will lead to other people being able to get access however they like, and sacramental, with their friends, at festivals, whatever. But this could easily be done both in the UK and the US, not by creating these therapy packages and, or just like total like free-for-all legalization, but through serious thought-out regulation where you could have an individual, this is just an idea, but one among many models, where you have an individual who goes to somebody who's already trained, a therapist or whatever, they're guided through a couple of journeys, they take the theory test, and then they get the license, and then they can do it like in groups or with their friends. They're an adult that can use it. They know the risks, they know how to do it safely, etc. And then they could do another one. Okay, they could apply for another license when they're already a trained, qualified therapist, where they're able to go and buy it and administer it for somebody else in the context of the ongoing psychotherapy relationship. There are ways to do this that don't require therapy packages, that don't require clinics, and that allow people to have access outside of the medical as well. Like, it's possible.
Thank you, everyone. And a quick shout out to Timothy Leary, who suggested that in the early 70s, well before his time. Problematic, yes, but he had some good ideas. So, wonderful stuff. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for a real mix of perspectives. We're going to open it up now to questions from you guys. Do you want another one?
Yeah, because we need one for the audience. This is what you...
Okay, I didn't hear what she said, but just a moment. Okay, fine. So, yes, please raise your hand nice and high if you'd like to ask a question.
I found everything you said very helpful, but what I kept thinking about for your dialogue was at what point did the pharmaceuticals fight back? Because when Ben was giving his example of 50... Okay. When Ben was giving his example of £50,000 over 6 months compared to his awakening, you're taking that money away from a pharmaceutical company, from a retreat company, or from wherever. And at some point, that I think that bites back, and they get more interested in this space, and that for-profit problem manifests a lot stronger. That's my senses. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's not forget that there's a lot of good, noble people working in the pharmaceutical industry who are clinicians who want to see the right things for their patients. If we just polarize this into everybody working in the pharmaceutical industry is just after profit and don't care about people, then you just don't understand the pharmaceutical industry. And it's a very lazy way of thinking into this black and white. Clinicians want to see their patients better, and they will choose the treatments that work. Funders, insurance companies, the NHS, care providers, GPs want to see the treatments that work for the cheapest. So I think psychedelics will speak for themselves, and if that undermines other old traditional treatments that cost more and don't work as well, we will indeed see those disappear. So let's continue to push for this and not worry about the fact that this is going to put other people out of business. We want the business in the psychedelics industry because it's the right bloody thing to do.
Can I just briefly, just to counter that somewhat. So I think I would agree. I think there are a lot of people in, say, pharmaceutical companies who have the absolute best intentions. I think the issue is with the current system we have, the embedded incentive structures, you can have the best intentions in the world, and if you are working within an institution that has a particular set of constraints and is playing a particular game, it doesn't matter an iota what your intentions are. So that's the issue, I think.
And I think we should attempt to make a more even playing field for psychedelics, because at the moment, because they are Schedule 1, it puts unknown, I mean, I know because I've been fighting it for 50 years, but the cost of getting GMP compounds, the cost of getting people who are prepared to do the research, is all weighted against psychedelics, and it's much more expensive than it would be if it wasn't Scheduled 1. And it's crazy that it is Schedule 1, that they should definitely go down to Schedule 3 or whatever. And that's vital to make it cheaper and more acceptable and more possible for society more generally to access it, which I think is essential. And I think that's the next stage.
I agree with Ben's view that, just putting it black and white won't work. Most of the time when we talk about pharma, we talk about like big pharma, and then the way they see markets and systems play out the way they like it. But for the first time, if you look at clinical trials, right, they've... Oh. Never happened. All right. But for the first time, we're seeing, if you look at clinical trials, if you look at the results, right, if you look at how many people are healed in these clinical trials, we've often seen just like incremental, slowly, like a bit better than the last time, or a bit less deadly than the last drug being developed going through clinical trials, right? And for the first time in clinical trials, we see patients being healed from the mental health diseases, right? And I always compare this with everybody in this traditional world who come with knives to the table for their clinical trials, and now psychedelics come with like a bazooka. I'm like, let's solve this, right? So I believe that, the better solution will strive and the better solution will win. We will see corporations, we will see big pharma trying to co-opt this with whatever, ketamine or Spravato, you name it. We've seen this all play out, and I believe that the best solution will play out and the best solution will provide. And in this sense, I also believe, the profitability of these organizations is very important, because that gives them sustainability so that they're also here tomorrow to guarantee access to these patients. So I think we can take over these certain parts of the system, we can innovate on them, but the psychedelic space comes with better solutions to certain mental health diseases. Of course, it's not the silver bullet to everything.
Okay, let's have another question.
My name is Andrea Wardon, and I have been advocating for the human and health rights of drug-dependent people mainly for almost 40 years. And there's a lot of great intention in here, and I think a bundle of love. And I feel very hopeful as both patient and parent. But mostly what I've done actually is try to advocate in corridors of power for a fucking long time. And I like to use the F word sometimes. Because while I totally, sir, I don't know your name with the beard, while I totally get that you can be ethical, as a man who, is actually involved in the capitalist system has its own thing, as the guy in the middle of this has said, and so we're always up against this nonsense, right? It was me and 2 other women and 2 other men who in 1998 started the lobbying at the United Nations around the prohibition, because our fucking families were dying of AIDS and we had enough of burying these people for a disease that was completely preventable, right? Now, because we are those people, we are also the people who worked on the trick stuff. Like, so some of you in this room will have heard of ACT-UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, right? So those of us whose bodies are fucking going to the wall continually have packaged, literally, we recently packaged medicines that we've taken from each other that we don't need any longer, sent them to drug users in Ukraine, and there are other ways to do it in a more powerful, sort of sustainable way, where, so what is the TR bit of trick? Somebody in the room help me.
So could you get to
the point is, no, I'm not asking a question, I'm telling you something, right, as somebody who knows a few things. Yes. The fact of the matter is, right, intellectual property rights have been something that we've worked with as activists to make the patents not be so bloody held in one space, whether it's geographical or otherwise, right? And in that way, patients with hepatitis C, HIV, and I hope now addiction, but God only knows with that one, will actually be able to access these treatments which you are now offering. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
time for a couple more. It's the gentleman in the back, yeah?
Hello. Question for Ozan, and it relates to the statement by the last lady. I listened enraptured by Rick Doblin's speech at the last Breaking Convention, where he mentioned a model that really stuck in my mind because it's very similar to a model I put forward in a master's dissertation. And we've been talking about sustainability, and we've been talking about various models, we've been talking about money. I'd be very interested just here, because from what I remember, there's a mixture, for a lot of people in the audience here that might not know, there is a kind of mixture that Rick was saying within the MAPS kind of methodology of non-profit and profit, so that investment could go into, but it wouldn't be owned by, if you see what I'm saying. Would you elucidate on that? Because I think it would be really, it struck me as the word sustainable. I think that's the word we all want to hear.
Sure thing. First things first, to the lady before, thank you very much for sharing your story and for your initiative and all the energy you put into this over all these years since the 90s. To answer your question, so, MAPS is built in a non-profit organization, and MAPS PBC, the Public Benefit Corporation, right, that follows certain strict guidelines to be a PBC. And the way we've structured MAPS fundraising vehicle is we had to structure it in a way, because the problem that Rick and his team saw over the last few years is, and this is very unfortunate, as the psychedelic space grew, also as an industry, they have seen, and this is also our research that shows this, we see that donations decrease over time. Because as we heard before, as Amanda said, now capital deployers are standing between the joys of, do I invest as a non-profit? Do I put money in a philanthropic way, or do I put money in and see a certain return, but I'm still supporting the psychedelic space, right? So the way we structured this is we needed MAPS to raise this amount as fast as possible, because once FDA approval sets in, MAPS data exclusivity of around 5 plus extension, 5.5, let's say 6 years before generics kick in, the data exclusivity of rounded up 6 years sets in and the timer goes on, right? And that's the time where MAPS can basically exclusively provide MDMA with the highest patient accessibility as a goal in the space. So we had to raise this money as fast as possible. The way we did this, it is a revenue share model. So there's no equity involved, so there are no MAPS shares or anything, which means there is no entity that can buy up voting power in MAPS and then, for example, vote on checking up prices or whatnot, right? So we kept this Chinese wall very strict. The baseline caveat was MAPS needs to remain non-profit, and the IP needs to be far away from investors, right? The IP is wholly owned by MAPS. No investor or anybody has access to it. So the way we structured this, it's a revenue share model that has a waterfall structure, has a cliff, so after 8 years there's no more revenue shared. Plus, when I say there's a waterfall model, the amount of revenue that gets shared with the investors decreases over time with a certain amount that has been returned. And this difference gets donated back to MAPS, the non-profit organization, then allowing MAPS again to do more research with other compounds or providing the program to underinsured groups, for example. This way we could create a novel financial instrument, we call it the regenerative financing vine, that gives MAPS the ability to raise funds very fast, but at the same time remain non-profit and don't go for profit and keep their culture and patient accessibility as the #1 goal. I hope that answers your question. And if I may add, our goal, sorry, I'll make it very quick. Our goal is to take the regenerative financing line. We've been very vocal about it. We want this now, once everything is finished, take our key learnings, our best practices out of this process, open source it all so that other organizations in this space can adapt it for their case and can start to use similar financial instruments to raise money, but keep their goals that they had originally. So our goal is actually to have this out there and try, as said before in this image of 1,000 flowers bloom, try to provide another tool for all these flowers to blossom.
I think as someone who's run a foundation, a non-profit foundation for the last 25 years or whatever it is, now with the more difficulty of raising philanthropic money, I'm wanting to evolve a system whereby one can have a sister for profit, but for ethical profit, low-level profit, enough to finance the research together with the philanthropists. And that's what I'm trying to work out, how one does that. Because depending on philanthropy alone, I'd love to, but if one can't, I'm determined to do the research. So one needs to evolve better ways which both can work, I feel.
Thanks. So we've got time for one final question.
This guy in the front is...
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you, speakers. We are observing a lot of pull and push, so I'm just going to speak to the clinical and therapeutic and also the indigenous way of practicing and consuming these substances and plant medicine. So what about the ecosystems? What about the education? You know, there's a lot of division, push and pull. Is it going to be this way or that way, the pharma or the indigenous way? However, growing up in London, coming from a very sort of Western city life, what about those living in tiny flats, raising 3 kids with 2 jobs, and you know, they don't have time to fly to Costa Rica or Peru to learn about the indigenous frameworks? What about bringing in, like Dr. Ben Sessa, I love his work, I love what he stands for because I understand the mental health framework. I meet many people who don't understand how these medicines lend itself to more detrimental, ways, if they don't understand. So the education is, for me, really critical at this point. What can we do to educate the families? Can we bring in and create ecosystems around families, bring in the mothers, the children, the fathers, aunts and aunties? Can we bring ecosystems to families and educate them? That's what would be my interest. Thank you.
I totally agree with that. You know, I think the whole idea of it is to bring it to everyone. And so for example, this is why I think the accessibility as well to people. We have such unlikely patients who've never heard of cannabis before, but you know, through word of mouth, through having one person tell the other, you know, oh, I've discovered this, you know, medicine and it's natural and it's worked for my rheumatoid arthritis. We've had so many patients come to us, and also because we have a bracket of being able to give the option of pay it forward. So we have a pay it forward system. For example, when people come to us for medicine and they can't afford it, we give them that option, you know, of someone paying it forward to them. And so we've had people who've never heard of cannabis before, or people who've only ever heard of the reefer madness. And I think that's the way that education is a really good way, because it has to come from a trusted source as well. Because a lot of people, I think when we use social media, there's so many algorithms that we only see what what we're into anyway. So having, like, via the communities that we work in and the communities that, you know, that we circulate in, that kind of education, I think that's the key of how to do it, is like one person speaking to the other, knowing that it comes from a trusted source, is my opinion. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Great question, absolutely. Education, ecosystems, dissemination, and what's wonderful to see is that this is happening in a way like it never has before. People talk about the psychedelic 60s. Well, we have far eclipsed the psychedelic 60s. Now is the psychedelic era. We have more research, more institutions. This is not some crazy fringe subject just carried out by bearded people in California. This is cutting-edge neuroscience. Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Harvard, UCLA, UCL, Johns Hopkins, you name it. These are not fringe organizations. These are cutting-edge neuroscience programs, and they all have psychedelic research programs running now. So Albert Hofmann, shortly before he died in 2008, he said, when the psychedelic renaissance happens, great book, by the way, when the psychedelic renaissance happens, the doctors must not be allowed to run the show. And the truth is, they are not running the show. We have the most wonderful network of psychedelic societies and clubs and organizations and festivals and conferences and gigs, more than ever before. We have dissemination, we have the internet, which has brought everyone together. We should all be immensely proud of this amazing multidisciplinary network that we've created and are creating here today.
What a wonderful place to end.